Now, Rand Paul is going to run for president in 2016. That seems clear. And when he's in the primary, of course, he's going to have to kiss Ronald Reagan's ass. That's a well-known tradition on the Republican side. Now we've seen it in primary after primary. Ronald Reagan, Ronald Reagan, Ronald Reagan. We've done mashups of that where the candidates combined say Ronald Reagan nearly 100 times in a debate. They do debates in the Ronald Reagan Library. It's endless, right? So lately, Rand Paul has been speaking really well about Ronald Reagan, talking about how he's of a similar mold as Reagan was in a couple of different areas in policy. Well, David Corn from Mother Jones has found some videos to the contrary back in 2007, 2008, etc., when he was campaigning for his dad, and then later in 2010 when he was campaigning for himself, where he did not seem to be as big a fan of Ronald Reagan. Now, if anything hurts you in a Republican primary, it's probably tapes like this.
The deficit went through the roof under Reagan. So how long did it take Ron Paul to figure out that the guy he had liked, endorsed, campaigned for, and campaigned for him? The very first budget. Ron Paul voted no against the very first Reagan budget. All the bold evils, everybody lauded this great budget. It was $100 billion in debt. This was 3 times greater than Jimmy Carter's worst deficit.
Domestic spending went up more rapidly in the 80s than it did under Carter. You know, we wanted Reagan to veto a budget or to have balanced budgets, and he didn't do it. And it wasn't anything personal against him. I think his philosophy was good. I just don't know that he had the energy or the follow-through to get what we needed.
When we had Reagan, we were fiscal conservatives. Well, unfortunately, even that wasn't true. When Reagan was elected in 1980, the first bill they passed was called the Graham-Latta Bill in 1981, and Republicans pegged it as this great step forward. Well, Jimmy Carter's last budget was about $36 billion in debt. Well, it turns out Reagan's first budget turned out to be $110 billion in debt. And each successive year, the deficit rose throughout Reagan's 2 terms.
We were in charge during the Reagan term, the next Bush's term, this last Bush. The deficits were horrendous under the Republicans. During Reagan's 2 terms, domestic spending went up faster than Jimmy Carter.
The deficit exploded because domestic spending rose faster under Reagan, so did military, but domestic spending rose faster under Reagan than under Jimmy Carter. We have to admit our failings because we're not going to get new people unless we become believable as a party again. Why did the deficit rise? Because spending rose more dramatically under Reagan than it did under Carter. We say, well, Reagan's a conservative, Carter's a liberal. Not necessarily always what it seems.
Now, this might be lethal in a Republican primary. To say something wrong about the Gipper? How dare you, Rand Paul? And the second sin here is that he's actually right. You actually can't argue with the numbers. Reagan did triple Carter's deficit and added tremendously to the debt, was not remotely fiscally conservative. In fact, he's being too kind to Reagan. Yes, the revenue went up over the span of 8 years under Reagan's watch, even though they cut taxes, but revenue normally goes up at a much greater clip. He slowed down the revenue coming in because he cut taxes so much. So, look, that's more of a mixed record, but his spending is not a mixed record. His spending was totally out of control. So Ron Paul, if he's a true fiscal conservative, he was right to vote against Reagan's budgets, and Rand Paul is right to point it out. It's just not something that might help you among Republicans, because now, of course, the Gipper is seen as some sort of holy figure. And the reality is, though, that Washington might be wrong about this as well. Now, because right now, they think, Rand Paul, this is a bigger sin than Chris Christie, closing down bridges, doing the political corruption, redirecting Superstorm Sandy aid for his own political benefit, even like basically giving away rubble from 9/11 for his own political gain. Like, all those things should disqualify Chris Christie. But when Republicans look at tapes like this, they think, that might disqualify Rand Paul more. How dare you say anything against the deity Ronald Reagan, right? But in reality, for example, in one of the speeches, he was talking to the Coalition of New Hampshire Taxpayers. That was back in July 2007. And he was speaking in favor of his dad, Ron Paul. Well, after he gave that speech against Reagan, obviously Ron Paul lost that straw poll, right? No, he won overwhelmingly, 65%. So there's something that they're not getting here. There's a difference between conventional wisdom in Washington and Republican politicians in Washington and their myth-making about Ronald Reagan, which, don't get me wrong, has worked to a great degree with a lot of the Republican voters. If you ask them if Ronald Reagan's a great president, they would say he's the best president, he's the greatest, yada, yada. We should name more airports after him. But if you break it down and say he spent too much and that he, in that sense, he did not really follow through on being a fiscal conservative, I think that a lot of the Republican voters, if you presented them with the facts, might agree with that. Now, if a Democrat said it, they would immediately shut it off and go, oh, no way, Gipper, right? But I think if a Republican who is a true libertarian and has very good conservative credentials says it, they might actually be open to that. I think Rand Paul is running a very savvy campaign. So if people think that this is going to do him in, I think they should think twice. So I'm very curious to see how he's going to do when the voters actually go into that voting booth. Because right now, I'm surprised every day at how savvy a politician Rand Paul is. And I'm now beginning to think that he actually has a chance at winning this thing, which I previously wouldn't have imagined. So don't count him out. Yes, it doesn't help to attack the Republican god, Ronald Reagan, okay? But it might be a little more clever than you think. And if he's positioned himself to the right of Ronald Reagan, it might be something that the Republican voters respond to.